Wow, what a stirring performance that was of a really important piece of music. Lift every voice and sing is what's called the Black National Anthem. And as gorgeous a performance as that was, we just engaged in a very racist behavior. Or so the argument is going on around clergy all over the place, once again at this time of year. That a predominantly white choir, and a predominantly white church, and a predominantly white community has no business whatsoever singing that song. In ways you don't even recognize. You yourself, and us, but you yourself don't even recognize you support and maintain our racist culture. Look around you. Look around the church. Where are the people of color? Look around Hopedale. Where are the people of color? Look at this sign. Let's put about a dozen of these on our lawn. In fact, let's hang a huge banner with 10 feet tall letters of this on the wall of our church, the way some of our sister churches do. Let's unlearn white privilege. The privilege you enjoy unjustly and unearned. Okay, stop. How do you feel right now? What's your emotional reaction to all that? Are you feeling defensive? Are you feeling angry? Did you feel insulted? Do you feel resentful? Were your feelings hurt that your minister dared to suggest that you are not good enough somehow when it comes to racism? Did it feel like I was making it seem that you are the KKK, not an honest white person trying to do the right thing? Did you feel fragile? Believe it or not, this is not a political sermon this morning. This is a deeply spiritual one. Because before we can do the social justice work of tackling racism, we have to do profoundly deep and internal spiritual work. The way someone needs to do a lot of work with depression or anxiety or obsessive-compulsive disorder or traumatic stress or addiction. The psychosocial, emotional work of dealing with those things comes first before action, in conjunction with action. So this is a deeply spiritual sermon today. So let's start with when we feel fragile. According to Robin DiAngelo, who's the professor of critical, multicultural, and social justice education at Westfield State, white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves and emotions. This includes outward display of anger or fear or guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving a stress-filled situation. And these behaviors, in turn, function to reinstate white racial equilibrium, power, and privilege. Professor DiAngelo goes on to say that there are lots of examples of the kinds of challenges that trigger this fragile response in a lot of white people. And I know it's true for me because they do in me. Suggesting that a white person's viewpoint comes from a racial frame of reference. That challenges our objectivity. When people of color talk directly about their own racial perspective and experience, this can be seen as a challenge to white taboos on talking openly and honestly about race. When people of color choose not to protect the racial feelings of white people in regards to racial discussions, this can be a challenge to white racial expectations and a need for racial comfort and not feeling guilty. People of color not being willing to tell their stories or answer questions to represent their race challenges the expectation that people of color are always in servile attitudes and positions. Another white person not providing agreement with someone's racial perspective can be a challenge to white solidarity. Receiving feedback that one's individual behavior had a racist impact is a challenge to white innocence. Suggesting that group membership is significant, that being black or a person of color or Latino or white is important, challenges our belief in individualism. Acknowledging that access is indeed unequal between racial groups challenges our idea of meritocracy. Being presented with a person of color in a position of leadership, say, such as President of the United States, can be a challenge to white authority and power. Being presented with information about other racial groups through, for example, movies in which people of color drive the action but are not in stereotyped roles, can be a challenge to white centrality. This idea of white fragility is not an accusation, just as depression or diabetes is not an accusation. It is an assessment of a reality and of current condition. It doesn't mean any white person, you or I or anyone else, are bad for being white. But our unexamined whiteness does hurt others, and it does continue to make the world an unsafe and unpredictable and unfair place for others. And there are certainly people who dismiss white fragility as just another way to make white people feel guilty. And these people, in a sense, prove the point. That it's not about white people feeling guilty. It's about, can we deal with the reality and the real feelings of other people who don't have our power and privilege. During the nomination hearings this week, Jeff Sessions said he's not a racist because he harbors no animosity for anyone based on their skin color. But this is to buy into the idea that racism is about individual acts of intolerance or hatred. But racism is not about the behavior of individuals who do hateful and hurtful things to others based on the color of a person's skin. Racism is a social, political, cultural, economic construction. It is so interwoven into our culture and our reality that it forms a matrix we don't see and often are completely unaware of because we are white. It's like Neo in the Matrix. We know something's wrong, but we're not exactly sure what it is or what to do about it. Even when people tell us the situation, it's hard to believe that our entire existence is some other reality than what we experience it as. That's very jarring. Sarah Watts, in a recent essay last past summer, offers 4 questions for white people to think about to see if we're experiencing fragility. Am I changing the subject? For example, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, do we have to talk about All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter? Do we change the subject? Am I using inappropriate humor to deflect my own anxiety as a white person? Like Black Labs Matter, because everyone's dog has to matter, right? Am I getting angry and defensive? I've never treated people of color badly. I never owned slaves. I'm not a racist. I'm not in the KKK. No one said you were. People were just talking about their experience. Am I going out of my way to focus on the positive? Things are better than they used to be. We had Dr. King. We had civil rights. We had a black president. You know, there's good. Well, yeah, but that's not the issue. It's still not good enough. Now, I think a lot of people in our culture, especially what I've witnessed in Unitarian Universalist culture, white progressive liberal activist culture, everybody's really angsty after the election results. It is the end of the world. Right? And recently on the show Blackish, Anthony Anderson's character, Dre Johnson, gave a fantastic monologue, which I want to quote a bit of because it sums this up. It says, no matter who won the election, Black people didn't expect things to get better, but they still voted because that's what you're supposed to do. He says to his coworkers, you think I'm not terrified about what Trump's going to do? But I'm used to things not going my way. I'm sorry you're not, and it's blowing your mind. So you'll excuse me if I didn't see all this outrage when all of this was happening to my people, since we are stuck on boats and chains. Right? We forget sometimes, I think, that white is an identity. We think of black or Latino as an identity, but in comparison to white, which is normative. But it's normative by construct and power, not because it is normative. If we don't understand whiteness, we can't understand blackness. If we don't understand maleness, we can't understand what it means to be a woman in our culture. If we don't understand our straightness, we can't understand what it's like to be gay. Because as we more deeply understand ourselves, we begin to learn to do better allowing other people to tell us about their selves and not needing them to be different for us. White privilege is not about the fact that some white people, lots of white people, are poor or have hardship. What it's about is even those people have privileges and get treatment that a person of color never gets in our society. Still. We heard in the reading this morning from Ta-Nehisi Coates that a lot of white people live in a dream. And I think it's the dream of any common culture, really. In our culture, it's white and male and Christian and straight, right? But it's this dream that this is the normative reality, right? Buddhism teaches us that all of this is a dream anyway. And the goal is to really experience reality as it is. And part of the racial problem in our culture is that we'd rather live in the dream. In fact, we love it when Martin Luther King talks about the dream. We talk about the dream every Martin Luther King Day because it prevents us from having to go deeper and do the real work of why we still have problems. Right? Oh, we include everybody. We're tolerant. There's still a lot of work to do there because we're still in the dream. The year I was born in 1966, Dr. King gave a keynote address at the UU, the Unitarian Universal Association General Assembly. Right? His talk was called Don't Sleep Through the Revolution. And what he talked to the UUs there at that gathering about was Rip Van Winkle. That there's a revolution going on in this culture. That people of color and poor people and all kinds of people are not taking it anymore. And he urged us as white liberals to not sleep through that revolution. To get awake and stay awake. That's what Ta-Nehisi Coates is talking about in this reading. Get out of that dream state. William Barber, Reverend William Barber, who started the Moral Mondays down in North Carolina, the way he's trying to frame it to all the coalition that's working on civil rights down there is stay woke. Don't just wake up. Stay woke. Don't go back into that dream, however easy it is to fall into. That your life is not being made uncomfortable in any way. And you have the privilege of not being uncomfortable if you don't want to be. Stay woke. Former UU President Bill Sinkert at last year's General Assembly referenced King and Coates. And Reverend Barber was there at some of our other events. And he too said, stay woke. We can't go back into the dream anymore or things don't get better. And it's so easy to go into this dream. You know the Scottish tale of Brigadoon? Right? Every 100 years there's this village in the Scottish Highlands that appears, right? And it's perfect, and everybody wanders in, has a wonderful time, and we should put that in the Borset Festival. We have Brigadoon show up, and you go into the village, and it's, this magical kingdom. However, during the day Brigadoon is visible. If anyone leaves, it goes away. The dream is shattered. Right? And I think somehow that's what this concept of white fragility is trying to teach us. That if we want to go out of the dream, it's going to shatter. We can't go back into it. We've got to stay woke. That's okay. It really is okay. I think one of the reasons it can be difficult for a congregation such as ours to get started with things like going into the community meal or going to Laundry Love and doing these things we do in our community is because you can't stay in the dream doing those things. You're intimately working with people who aren't experiencing the privilege of dreaming. Their world is different. And then we interact with it, and it's hard to go back to sleep after we do that. You know, you go take a walk through Hopedale, and you're probably not going to be confronted with too much that's going to make you wake up out of that dream. But if you take a walk through downtown Milford, you're going to see a lot of brown people and a lot of Spanish and a lot of Portuguese signs. And there's no way you can stay asleep being confronted with that. But we, as white people in our culture, we have the privilege of dismissing it and not thinking about it anymore and going back and going about our lives. Since I've arrived here, some people have asked me why I don't live in Hopedale. Well, one reason is partly economic. I got a son I'm putting through a very expensive college. 2 years to go. Can't wait. So part of it's economic. The just economic reality is I can get a bigger, nicer apartment in Milford for less money than I'd get something like that in Hopedale. It's just the economic reality. But the other is a personal thing with me that I've been doing for a long time. I choose to live in places that force me to stay a little more woke. When I first got married, when I was married, we intentionally lived in a neighborhood in Leominster called French Hill, which was called French Hill because that's where all the French Canadians, who people mistreated with lots of prejudice at the time, were forced almost to live. And over the years, each new wave of immigration in Leominster lived in French Hill. So at the time, my wife and I, we chose to live there. It was largely a Puerto Rican, Dominican, Vietnamese, and Hmong neighborhood. And we had family who said, why do you want to live there? And I didn't quite have the language I do now, but the reason I wanted to live there is I wanted to stay a little more woke. And I've lived and worked in Spanish Harlem, and when I worked at one of our Houston churches, I lived on Navigation Street in Houston. That's the heart of the Mexican barrio, going way back. I was the only white person who lived on the street. It didn't make me a saint, it didn't make me a martyr, it didn't make me better. It's a personal thing for me. Like, I know how hard it is for me to stay at the level of engaged I call myself to. And where I live helps me do that in little daily ways. Remind me that different people have different experiences of this reality. We all got to get into the same dream somehow. So that's something I do for me. It doesn't mean you're bad if you don't do it. That's how I go about a spiritual task for myself of trying to stay a little more woke. Some things we all can do. We can acknowledge our white racial identity. White is a racial group. Yes, there is no such thing as race. Biologically, there are no races, but race is a very real construct. And as a construct people created, it is a construct we can get rid of. Same with poverty. Same with sexism, all kinds of stuff. But white is an identity. And it is not normal, but it is the one granted all the power by default. You know, we can be okay with being uncomfortable. We can be willing to go into situations where we lay aside privilege and power and position and try to put aside our need to not feel fragile, and we can develop relationships with people who are different than us. Very different than us. They may look different, they may speak different languages, they may have a different culture. When we do this, even in the smallest of ways, we stay a little more woke. We can take action. It's one thing to know we need to wake up, but it's another thing to put the alarm clock across the room so we actually have to get out of bed to shut it off. Right? What's an example of being a little more woke in our own tradition? Well, I want to tell you a little bit about James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo. Have you heard of these people before? Some of you have. James Reeb was a white Unitarian minister from the Boston area. And during the Selma, Alabama protest, when Dr. King and a bunch of people approached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were descended upon by local and state police and tear gas and billy clubs, and it was called Bloody Sunday. And following Bloody Sunday, Dr. King put out a call to the country for people of faith to come to Selma and join them. James Reeb left his very white Unitarian ministry in Boston and answered the call. After one of the gatherings, as they were planning on what to do next with their protest leading up to the march that was successful, James Reeb went to dinner one night with two other white ministers. They went to a black-owned restaurant, which was the only restaurant in Birmingham willing to serve the black and white people there for the protest. Upon leaving the restaurant after dinner, they were descended upon by a group of white men who beat James Reeb to death with clubs. Viola Liuzzo was a white woman, Unitarian Universalist from Detroit, Michigan. When she saw the Selma news and heard the call to go to Selma from Dr. King, she woke up out of her suburban white dream and went to Selma. After the successful Selma march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the people had marched from Selma to Montgomery. So people who were from Selma needed to get back to Montgomery. So Viola Liuzzo was one of the people with a car, and she just kept ferrying people back home from Montgomery back to Selma. She had a 19-year-old African-American young man in her car, was driving him back to Selma when another car pulled up alongside them in the road, containing a number of KKK members. They took out a gun and they shot Viola Liuzzo in the head. She is, as far as we know, the only white woman to die in the civil rights movement. Staying woke can be dangerous, but I don't think we're not called to be martyrs like James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo. They're inspirational, and I think they're good for us to look up to. But they also teach us some really interesting lessons. When LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act, he mentioned James Reeb. Why does a white guy who get killed gets mentioned? But the reality was, it took the death of a white minister in Selma to wake up a lot of people. As long as the black people were getting killed, that wasn't enough to wake everybody up. Right? Fascinating. And they are great examples of when we wake up, we usually feel we need to do something. Sometimes doing something is dangerous. Sometimes it's not really dangerous. It's those times we need to focus on first. The simple acts of not being so fragile, offended, resentful, hurt, angry. When somebody like me says, is he talking about racism and injustice stuff again? Yeah. Because part of my job is to keep us woke. But it's not a social justice political thing. It is a deeply spiritual thing. The civil rights protesters of the civil rights era and Dr. King's era, they signed a commitment card where they made promises and very awake understanding of what they were signing up to do. But it was a call to spiritual practice as much as it was a call to any kind of action. This is what was on their commitment card. I hereby pledge myself, my person, and my body to the nonviolent struggle. Therefore, I will keep the following commandments. Meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. Now, you understand all these people are Christians, so that was a normative, right? But for us, it could be whatever our spiritual practice is. Remember always that the nonviolent movement seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. There is no victory when we're all in this together. There is just getting your brother and sister to understand that they're hurting and need to stop. Walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. Pray daily that all people might be free. Sacrifice personal wishes in order that all people might be free. Staying woke and being uncomfortable go together. Observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of civility and courtesy. Boy, is that a lesson we could all use to take up. Seek to perform regular service for others. Refrain from violence of fist, tongue, and heart. Strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health. Follow the directions of the movement, take part in its decision-making, and obey the captain on a demonstration. I sign this pledge, having seriously considered what I do and with the determination and will to persevere. Other things I can do to help: run errands, drive my car, fix food, do some administrative and clerical work, make phone calls, answer phones, do some copying, make signs, distribute information and leaflets. That was their commitment card. Might we all sign our commitment card? Those tasks are still required of all of us today. We might add to the list today: I will speak up when other white people say and do hurtful things from a position of privilege and power. I will not get offended when told that my own behavior or words are racist, but I will seek to understand how and why what I'm doing or saying is hurtful to someone else. Dealing with racism is a spiritual practice. It's not a political act. White privilege and white fragility are not something we should resent or feel belittled by. It's just there. It's a thing, and we need to deal with it. We need to face these things and deal with them the way we would deal with any deep emotional, spiritual work that we got to do: depression, anxiety, traumatic stress, addiction. It's an internal process we need to engage to help make external things better. My friend G, guy who's living in Houston now, he likens white fragility and white privilege to addiction. And others have made this argument. And it's like we can't get better until we have the courage to confront our problem, right? And he says, you know, if we can't begin a conversation about the white culture's problems with racism until we get an agreement from people of color that we ourselves are not racist, that's like an addict who isn't willing to talk about the difficulty in their life and why their life is a mess if it has to include a discussion about their using. Right? He says, there is no shame, right, in asking for help. Asking for help is a sign of strength, not of weakness. So as we engage this, we too can ask for help. How do we get better at staying woke? There is no shame in being white. But just as a family with addicts in it can't be healthy until the addiction is named and dealt with instead of being enabled, so too can our lives and our community and our nation not be healthy until we stop enabling the addictions to whiteness, white power, and white privilege. Getting past our discomfort in dealing with these things, getting past our guilt, our need to make someone else's pain about our feelings, until we get past this, we can't get into the work of creating the world we dream about and a better future. Doing this work in our month of courage takes courage. It requires bravery. It's like that first step into a therapist's office or that first 12-step meeting. Just a simple act of hitting the alarm clock and getting out of bed is a supreme act of courage. Because it's not easy and it can be painful. But it means allowing ourselves to be uncomfortable and in a little pain now in order to be healthy for the long term.